the race for global dominance. By the beginning of the 18th century, Britain had established colonies across North America, profitable plantations in the Caribbean, and growing trade networks stretching toward Africa and Asia. Yet despite this impressive progress, it was still far from becoming the world's dominant empire. Several powerful rivals stood in its way. France controlled vast territories in North America and possessed one of Europe's strongest armies. Spain continued to rule enormous lands across the Americas, while the Dutch remained masters of international trade and finance. The struggle for global supremacy had only just begun. Unlike previous centuries, these conflicts would not be fought only on European battlefields. The world's oceans, distant colonies, and profitable trade routes became equally important. Every island, harbor, and strategic port suddenly carried enormous value. Control of the seas increasingly meant control of global commerce. One popular myth claims that Britain simply conquered territory through military force alone. In reality, victory depended just as much on economics. The nation that could build more ships, finance larger expeditions, maintain reliable supply lines, and protect merchant fleets often gained the greatest advantage. Britain's expanding banking system, private investors, and thriving commercial class provided resources that many rivals struggled to match. Money became another powerful weapon. The Royal Navy continued to expand at an extraordinary pace. New shipyards appeared along Britain's coastline, producing larger and more heavily armed warships. Experienced officers developed advanced naval tactics, while improved navigation allowed fleets to remain at sea for longer periods. Britain was quietly building the most powerful navy the world had ever seen. At the same time, the British government strengthened its relationship with private trading companies. None was more influential than the East India Company. Originally created to trade spices and textiles, the company steadily increased its influence across the Indian subcontinent. It established fortified trading posts, negotiated alliances with local rulers, and employed its own soldiers to defend commercial interests. Few corporations in history have ever possessed such extraordinary power. In many regions, the company acted almost like an independent nation. Meanwhile, another fierce rivalry was unfolding across North America. British settlers continued moving westward, while French colonies expanded along the Lawrence River and deep into the Mississippi Valley. Both empires sought control of valuable fur trade routes and strategic waterways. As settlements grew closer together, conflict became increasingly inevitable. Small frontier skirmishes gradually escalated into a much larger struggle. This conflict would eventually become part of the 7 Years' War, often described by historians as the first true global war. Battles erupted across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. Never before had so many continents been connected by a single conflict. For Britain, the stakes could not have been higher. Victory would secure access to enormous territories and profitable trade routes. Defeat could destroy decades of expansion. British commanders understood that success depended upon cooperation between the army and the navy. Warships protected supply lines across the Atlantic while transporting soldiers wherever they were needed. This ability to rapidly move forces between continents became one of Britain's greatest strategic advantages. After years of bitter fighting, Britain emerged victorious. France surrendered much of its North American territory, dramatically changing the balance of power. Britain now controlled vast lands stretching from the Atlantic coast toward the interior of the continent. Its influence also expanded in India, where the East India Company gained even greater political and military authority. The empire had entered a completely new stage. No longer was Britain simply establishing isolated colonies. It had become a global power capable of shaping events across multiple continents at the same time. However, rapid expansion also created new challenges. Protecting distant territories required enormous financial resources. Maintaining soldiers, forts, ships, and colonial governments became increasingly expensive. Many British politicians believed the American colonies should help pay these costs through new taxes. They had no idea that this decision would eventually trigger one of history's most famous revolutions. But that story belongs to the next chapter. For now, Britain stood at the height of its confidence. Its merchants controlled expanding trade networks. Its navy ruled the seas. Its influence reached farther than ever before. The foundations of the greatest empire in history had finally been laid. The American Revolution. The empire's first great loss. By the middle of the 18th century, Britain stood as the most powerful nation on earth. Its navy dominated the oceans, its merchants traded across every continent, and its colonies stretched farther each year. Many believed that nothing could stop the empire's rise, but history has a way of surprising even the greatest powers. Ironically, Britain's greatest challenge would not come from France or Spain. It would come from its own colonies. After the costly 7 Years' War, Britain found itself burdened with enormous debt. Victory had expanded the empire, but maintaining soldiers, forts, and ships across North America required vast amounts of money. British leaders believed the solution was obvious. The American colonies should help pay for their own defense. Parliament introduced a series of new taxes, including the Stamp Act and later the Townshend Acts. From London's perspective, these measures were reasonable. The colonies had benefited from British protection. Surely they could contribute to its cost. Many colonists saw the situation very differently. They argued that they had no representatives in Parliament, and therefore should not be taxed by a government in which they had no voice. The phrase "no taxation without representation" quickly became a rallying cry throughout the colonies. A common myth suggests that every American wanted independence from the beginning. The truth was far more complicated. For many years, most colonists considered themselves loyal British subjects. They admired the king, traded with Britain, and hoped only for greater political rights, not complete independence. It was the growing conflict that gradually pushed many toward revolution. Tensions reached a breaking point in Boston. British soldiers were stationed in the city to maintain order, but their presence only increased resentment. In 1770, a confrontation between soldiers and civilians turned deadly in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Although only 5 civilians were killed, newspapers transformed the incident into powerful anti-British propaganda. Public opinion shifted dramatically. 3 years later came another famous event, the Boston Tea Party. Disguised as indigenous Americans, colonial protesters boarded British ships and threw hundreds of chests of tea into Boston Harbor. It was not simply about tea. It was a direct challenge to British authority. London responded with harsh punishments known as the Intolerable Acts. Instead of restoring order, these measures united many of the colonies against Britain. In 1775, fighting finally erupted. What began as scattered clashes between colonial militias and British soldiers soon developed into a full-scale war. At first, few believed the colonies could possibly defeat the greatest military power in the world. Britain possessed experienced professional soldiers, powerful warships, and enormous financial resources. The colonies had limited weapons, little training, and almost no organized army. Yet they held several important advantages. They knew the land. Local militias could move quickly through forests and mountains unfamiliar to British troops. Supplies often traveled shorter distances, while Britain had to transport soldiers and equipment across the Atlantic Ocean, a journey that could take months. Logistics became one of Britain's greatest problems. Then another unexpected development changed everything. France entered the war, still eager to weaken Britain after losing territory during the 7 Years' War. France supplied weapons, money, soldiers, and naval forces to the American cause. Spain and the Dutch Republic later joined the conflict against Britain as well. The war had once again become global. Battles were fought not only in North America but also across the Caribbean, Europe, Africa, and the Indian Ocean. One popular myth claims that George Washington won every battle. In reality, he suffered several painful defeats. His greatest strength was perseverance, rather than destroying the British army in a single decisive victory. Washington kept his forces together, avoided complete defeat, and waited for opportunities to strike when conditions favored his army. His patience proved decisive. The turning point came in 1781. British General Charles Cornwallis established defensive positions at Yorktown, Virginia. What appeared to be a secure location quickly became a trap. French naval forces blocked British reinforcements from reaching the coast, while combined American and French armies surrounded the town. After weeks of bombardment, Cornwallis surrendered. The defeat shocked Britain, although fighting continued for some time. Yorktown effectively ended Britain's attempt to retain the 13 colonies. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially recognized the independence of the United States. For the first time, Britain had lost one of its most valuable colonial possessions. Many observers believed the British Empire had begun its irreversible decline, but they were wrong. Instead of collapsing, Britain adapted. Its leaders shifted their attention toward Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. The loss of America forced Britain to rethink how an empire should be governed. Ironically, Losing the 13 colonies would eventually encourage even greater expansion elsewhere. The empire had suffered its first great defeat, but its greatest period of growth was still yet to come. The jewel of the empire, the loss of the American colonies, was a devastating blow to Britain's pride. Many European leaders believed the British Empire had entered its final chapter. They assumed that without its richest colonies in North America, Britain's global influence would slowly fade. Instead, the opposite happened. Rather than looking west across the Atlantic, Britain turned its attention east. Across the Indian Ocean lay one of the richest regions on Earth, a land famous for spices, silk, cotton, precious stones, and ancient civilizations. For centuries, India had attracted merchants from around the world. Now Britain saw something even greater than trade. It saw an opportunity to build an empire unlike any before. At the center of this transformation stood the East India Company. Originally founded as a trading company, it had gradually evolved into a powerful political and military force. It negotiated treaties, collected taxes, commanded private armies, and controlled major ports along India's coastline. No ordinary business had ever possessed such extraordinary authority. Many historians describe the East India Company as the first multinational corporation, with the power to wage war. By the late 18th century, the once powerful Mughal Empire was weakening. Regional kingdoms competed for influence, creating political instability across much of the subcontinent. The East India Company took advantage of this situation. Rather than conquering India all at once, British officials often formed alliances with local rulers. Some kingdoms welcomed British support against rival states, believing the company to be a useful partner. Few realized that these alliances would eventually place much of India under British control. One of the most important turning points came after the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Although the battle itself involved relatively small armies, its consequences were enormous. The company's victory allowed it to gain influence over Bengal, one of India's wealthiest provinces. Revenue collected from Bengal financed further expansion across the subcontinent. Instead of relying entirely on soldiers sent from Britain, the East India Company recruited large numbers of Indian troops known as sepoys. These soldiers became the backbone of Britain's military presence in Asia. This arrangement allowed Britain to control vast territories without deploying massive European armies. It was a strategy that would later be repeated in other parts of the empire. A common myth claims that Britain conquered India solely through military superiority. The reality was much more complex. Diplomacy, political alliances, local rivalries, economic influence, and administrative organization were often just as important as battlefield victories. Britain succeeded not simply because it fought well, but because it understood how to exploit divisions that already existed. As British influence expanded, so did commerce. Indian cotton, tea, indigo, silk, and spices flowed toward Britain. In return, British manufactured goods entered Indian markets in ever-growing quantities. The Industrial Revolution further strengthened this relationship. New factories in Britain produced textiles faster and more cheaply than ever before. Steam-powered machines transformed manufacturing, while improved transportation connected ports, factories, and markets with remarkable efficiency. For Britain, India became both a valuable source of raw materials and an enormous market for finished products. Economic power and imperial expansion became inseparable. Yet British rule also brought significant change to the subcontinent. Roads and bridges were expanded. Modern ports grew larger. New educational institutions introduced Western sciences and engineering. Later, thousands of kilometers of railways connected cities that had previously been separated by weeks of travel. The railway network became one of the largest ever built during the 19th century. However, these developments came with a price. Many traditional industries struggled to compete with imported British goods. Local artisans lost livelihoods that had existed for generations. Economic policies often favored Britain's interests over those of the local population. The benefits of modernization were unevenly distributed. This remains one of the most debated aspects of British rule in India. As Britain's influence continued to grow, so did resistance. Different communities viewed foreign rule in different ways. Some cooperated with the British administration. Others increasingly questioned its authority. Tensions slowly accumulated beneath the surface. The empire appeared stronger than ever, but cracks had already begun to form. By the beginning of the 19th century, Britain controlled trade routes that connected Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Its navy protected shipping lanes across the world's oceans. Its merchants grew wealthier every year. Its industries fueled an economy unlike anything Europe had previously experienced. The British Empire was entering its golden age. Soon it would become so vast that people would famously say, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." And for a time, that statement was remarkably close to the truth. The empire where the sun never set. By the early 19th century, Britain had become the world's leading global power. Its ships crossed every major ocean, its merchants traded on every continent, and its flag flew over territories thousands of miles apart. The empire was expanding faster than ever before. People would soon begin repeating a famous phrase, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." Unlike many legends, this one was almost entirely true. Because Britain controlled lands in North America, the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, Australia, and countless islands across the Pacific, daylight was always shining somewhere within the empire. No previous empire had ever connected so much of the world, but maintaining such an enormous empire required more than soldiers and warships. It required speed. It required communication. And above all, it required technology. Fortunately for Britain, another revolution was changing the world. The Industrial Revolution. Steam engines transformed factories into centers of mass production. Iron replaced wood in bridges, railways, and eventually ships. Coal-powered machines that could work day and night. Britain became known as the workshop of the world. Its factories produced textiles, machinery, weapons, and manufactured goods at a scale never before imagined. These products were shipped across the empire, while raw materials flowed back to British ports. Cotton arrived from India and Egypt. Tea came from India and Ceylon. Rubber was collected from Southeast Asia. Wool arrived from Australia. Gold and diamonds were mined in Africa. The empire had become one enormous economic network. A common myth claims Britain simply took resources from its colonies without giving anything in return. The truth is more complicated. British rule introduced railways, telegraph lines, modern ports, legal systems, universities, and hospitals in many regions. However, these developments were often designed to strengthen imperial administration and expand trade, rather than improve the lives of local populations. Many colonies benefited from new infrastructure. Others paid a heavy economic and social price. Historians continue debating this balance today. Perhaps no innovation symbolized Britain's power more than the railway. Thousands of kilometers of track stretched across India, Canada, South Africa, and Australia. Goods that once required weeks to transport could now reach ports within days. Armies could move rapidly to troubled regions. Communication became faster than ever before. Then came another remarkable invention, the electric telegraph. For centuries, news traveled only as fast as a horse or sailing ship. Now messages crossed continents in minutes. In 1870, Britain completed an international telegraph network linking London with India. Government officials could make decisions almost instantly. Despite being separated by thousands of kilometers, the empire had become connected by invisible wires beneath oceans and across deserts. London truly became the center of a global system. Meanwhile, Queen Victoria had become the symbol of Britain's extraordinary success. Her reign lasted more than 60 years and became known as the Victorian era. During this period, Britain's population grew rapidly. Cities expanded. Railways connected the country. Scientific discoveries accelerated. Literature, engineering, medicine, and industry flourished. In 1877, Queen Victoria received a new title, Empress of India. The title reflected Britain's growing influence over the Indian subcontinent, now considered the most valuable possession within the empire. Many politicians proudly referred to India as the jewel in the crown. Yet not everyone welcomed British rule. Throughout the empire, resistance never completely disappeared. One of the most significant uprisings occurred in India in 1857, known as the Indian Rebellion or the Sepoy Mutiny. It began among Indian soldiers serving in the East India Company's army. The causes were numerous: religious concerns, political grievances, economic pressures, growing dissatisfaction with foreign control. The rebellion spread across northern India, leading to months of fierce fighting. Although Britain eventually regained control, the consequences were enormous. The British government dissolved the East India Company and assumed direct rule over India. An era dominated by a private corporation had come to an end. The British Raj had begun. Across Africa, Britain's influence also expanded dramatically. During the late 19th century, European powers competed fiercely for territory in what became known as the Scramble for Africa. Britain secured control over Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, and numerous other regions. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 made Egypt especially important. The canal created the fastest sea route between Britain and India. Protecting this passage became one of London's highest strategic priorities. British soldiers, engineers, merchants, and administrators could now travel between Europe and Asia much more quickly than ever before. Trade increased enormously. The empire reached its greatest territorial extent during the early 20th century. Nearly 1/4 of the world's land surface belonged to Britain. Roughly 1 out of every 4 people on Earth lived under British rule. No empire in history had ever governed so many different cultures, languages, religions, and peoples. To supporters, Britain represented stability, global trade, and technological progress. To critics, it represented foreign domination and economic exploitation. Both perspectives contain elements of truth. The British Empire transformed the modern world in ways that are still visible today. But its greatest challenge was approaching. A conflict unlike anything humanity had ever experienced was about to begin. The First World War would test the strength of the empire as never before.